Started. So today's webinar is the 2022 Advocacy Tune-Up. And you know, there's a lot we need to do about advocacy. And so this is our chance to, so today what we're going to do is welcome everyone. Basically, we're going to have a great presentation. We'll have a chance for question and answers, and then we'll close out with our normal things. So first, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Steve Murray is the director of the Alabama Department of Archives History, the state agency that serves as the permanent repository for state government records, a special collections library, and the State Histories Museum. Steve Murray became the director in 2012 and has served for 6 years as the assistant director for administration. And that was after that. His prior experience in public history includes serving as the managing editor of the Encyclopedia of Alabama and the Alabama Review, both at Auburn University. Steve is a previous member of the CoSA Board of Directors and served as its treasurer, and he is currently the co-chair of the CoSA Advocacy Committee. Our other presenter today is Jody Foley. Jody is a native Montanan who was born and raised in beautiful Missoula. There, she attended the University of Montana as an undergraduate and a graduate student studying social history. She joined the staff of the Montana Historical Society in Helena in 1990 and worked her way up from archival tech to oral history archivist, and finally state archivist, serving in that latter position for 15 years until her retirement in 2021. She's been active in CoSA since 2005, serving on several committees as a board member, as vice president, and finally president. She is currently the co-chair of the Advocacy Committee. So thank you both for being our presenters today. And I'm going to turn this over to Jody.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to the 2022 Advocacy Tune-Up webinar. Steve Murray and I are excited to use this time to review the great advocacy resources available on the CoSA website, provide examples of successful advocacy efforts by fellow CoSA members and others, and ask you to share your advocacy experiences, any tools and resources that are your favorites, and let us know about your advocacy needs. Next slide, please. Got some fancy stuff there. Okay, so we're going to start with a couple of quotes that I think really capture key elements of successful advocacy efforts, those being preparation, flexibility, and persistence. I'm going to go with Kathleen's quote first. This really gives you the idea of that advocacy isn't a one and done sort of thing, that it's really about shaping and crafting an advocacy message to your audience. And then being willing and able to do some preparation work so that you can take advantage of advocacy opportunities that arise because you've got some tools at the ready. And you have to realize that with any kind of advocacy that you're going to have to do it again and again and again and have to be patient. The other quote there, fortune favors the prepared, is one of my favorite directors. Favorite movie of all time is Bringing Up Baby. But it is true that if you have materials prepared when the opportunity is put before you, you're in much better stead to be able to take advantage of it. Next slide. So to help our members in preparing and sustaining advocacy, CoSA has created several tools. We've also hosted webinars and provided links to similar resources from fellow archival organizations and allied fields. As I review some of those resources, please be thinking of ways that you could use them. Specifically looking at these three types or areas that you could grab material from and use. The first being language. You know, we have put a lot of work into the presentations that we've done and the tools that we've done for CoSA, and there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. Just look at the language in some of these resources and see if you can use them to tweak your particular needs. Or pull language from resources to write your arguments for advocacy, I should say. The other piece is structure. You can look at the tools that we've created and see if some of those tools you can take the material, put in what will be useful for you, or just thinking about ways to plan for advocacy events or strategizing that other folks have done and used and to great success. And of course, the other piece is authority, either pointing to CoSA as the authority for best practice or looking at what other people have used for authorities, such as SAA, NARA, NAGARA, really to show a solidarity amongst professional organizations and a consistency in message. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are resources that are available, and we're going to talk about these real quickly. All of these have been crafted with care by fellow state archivists or staff members or members of allied organizations. And I'd like to share the screen if I could, Becky. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so let's look under advocacy. So once you log in, look under advocacy. First one, advocacy alerts. Now these are succinct and timely statements crafted with the unique needs and concerns of state archives or professions in mind. Let's see if I can, there we go. If you look at some of these, like the recommendations sent to the Biden team, that's something where you can look at what was deemed by the Council of State Archivists as important elements in making the argument for good records management to the Biden team as they transitioned in. Great language there that you could use. The next one there, cultural diversity, we're all struggling with how we make that happen within our institutions. And there's some really good language in that statement as well that you could pull in as a hook to talk to whoever it is that you're trying to get to do what you need them to do for good advocacy for the elements that you need for funding or what have you. So advocacy alerts are really good to draw a lot of language from. The next one, the issues, briefs, and position statements. We can get that to go there. Same kind of thing where you're looking at language, but you're also looking here at some of the structure. Not sure if that's going to come up, but I'm just going to talk about this real quick. One of the issue statements on that page is about EAD, the other EAD, and looking at, oh, here we go. Educating for American democracy. So if the hook that you need for your advocacy piece, it relates to the importance of civics and civics engagement, there's some really good language that you can draw on through that position statement. Or central characteristics of an archivist of the United States, there's still elements in there that might be very helpful if you're trying to get your state to actually hire a state archivist. We had some issues in the past where positions were open too long, and so CoSA was able to write something, send that to an individual state, say, you know, this position is really important. So if you're in that kind of situation, there's very good language there. Again, language about cultural diversity and access. So those are really good. And then going down to advocacy resources. The importance of state archives is a really good piece. And this is one of those that you can look at the language and you know, pull out things that will help you make an individual argument for your particular state archives, but then also looking at the structure here, where you've got on the right-hand side sort of bullet points. Those are things that might be more useful for one type of audience. But then on the other side are the stories about how state archives impact people, and that might be a better hook for you. But then the document itself, the way that it's overall organized could be very helpful. Here's another section that deals with more stats, and maybe that's the better hook for whoever it is that you need to talk to. The best thing I can say is just get in here and look around and play with and read through some of these pieces, and you'll get a better idea of how they might be helpful for you. We've also put in some resources from other institutions or organizations that would be very helpful. I think the American Alliance of Museums has some fantastic materials on advocacy, including, if you scroll down here, some economic impact statements, education impact statements that, again, you can look at the language and tweak it into something that would be helpful for your efforts. Okay, I'm going to move on to another big resource, which is the programs that we do in general and research, but the webinars in particular. So you can get at those from the programs, or you can go to resources and down to videos and recordings. You can go to electronic records if you're specifically looking for advocacy related to that. I'm going to quick search here. That's not what I wanted. That. Okay, so this is a really good resource, really good webinar that our own Steve Murray did. Lessons learned from the Birmingham Public Library. And the reason that I think this is a really good one to listen to is it's a great example of a complex advocacy effort that brings a diverse group of stakeholders together, in this case to support the Birmingham Public Library, whose collections were unfortunately put in peril due to extreme staff cuts, COVID-related budget issues. But the support is coordinated from the national, state, local, and institutional levels. So CoSA was involved, every library was involved, the state archives, obviously, staff members within the library, friends groups, and the state and national worked as the authorities to assist the local stakeholders to respond locally, which is really important because the local authorities of government are going to listen more to their constituency. It's also a really good, provides a couple of really good tools, one of which is a statement on the risk to research collections at the Birmingham Public Library, which is a very well-written, succinct statement of why those collections were so important and why basically leaving them unmanned as a result of these cuts would put them at risk, and what that would mean, what the impact was, could be as a result of that. And then also, it's a really good resource for looking at this idea of preparing for the next crisis, because it's going to happen, unfortunately. And it just has some really good information on how to think about using your experience and what you've learned to face the next crisis, but also to get yourself in a situation where you have tools that will help you better to respond. So that is a really good one to take a look at. And then another one I think would be really helpful to look at is, let's see if I can get this one. I'm going to try a different way of searching. If you go into the CoSA webinar series, to the right here is full text search ability, which is wonderful. And this is provided by Aviary. And see if it'll come up. Okay, so this is another really great resource, I think, that I think everybody would benefit from looking at. And you might say, well, this has to do with districts, congressional offices, home offices. So what's that got to do with local advocacy? I would argue that the approaches to advocacy are the same in terms of looking at consistency in your message, ensuring that leadership is getting the message from you in one way, from professional organizations related to whoever they are, whether they're the governor's office or secretary of state or whatever. Being concise in your messaging, figuring out who the best people are to talk to, because sometimes you're not going to be able to talk to the person, the actual policymaker. You need to talk to staff members and get the information through them to whoever it is, who is the policymaker. And this provides really good information on how to do some of those things and approach by folks who have a lot of experience with advocacy, not only on the federal level, but on the local level. And also, you know, just thinking about professional courtesies and follow-up and that sort of thing. So this is a really good resource in that sense. And then one more. It's good to remember that we have recordings related to, that Siri creates recordings as well. And Siri has great webinar that they put on specifically about electronic records. No, that's not going to come up. Okay, well, I'm just going to go ahead and talk about it. What's important about this is a webinar that was done by the Joint Working Group on Issues and Awareness, which is CoSA, NAGARA, RAC, and SAA, as a follow-up onto Archives on the Hill. I just think that this is another one that really gives you good information about, oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong one here, excuse me. This is advocacy in electronic records. So this gives you a lot of great tools, one of which is how to do an elevator speech, how to prepare that. And you would just look under YouTube for elevator speech under Siri. Talks about how to get the right hook for the right person that you're trying to convince. Leveraging past successes, looking at how you work with IT and making them into advocates for you if you can through your relationship with them, and also teaching records custodians and those folks and getting them on board as advocates as well. And I put a couple of things in that at the very beginning of the chat, one of which is the dreaded question, why don't you digitize everything? Which is something that the folks in this webinar talk about as well. And there's a really good, quick, concise video that you can look at that's called Why Don't You Digitize Everything? So do take a look at that as well. Okay, I'm done sharing here, I think. So let's do that. Go back to the slides if we could, Becky. All right. Okay, so we've gone through all of those resources, and at this point, I think I'll let Steve take over. We're going to have, you can go one more slide. There you go. We will have time at the end of this for questions about any of the resources that I talked about, and hopefully you will share some of your resources and favorite tips as well. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Jody, and it's good to be with you all today. I just want to start by thanking Jody for continuing in retirement to be part of the leadership of CoSA. Our professional community is so blessed to have retired state archivists who continue to serve through CoSA's committees and as kind of informal advisors on a whole host of topics, and Jody's one of those, and I appreciate her willingness to continue serving as co-chair of the Advocacy Committee. It's been a great joy to serve with her in that capacity.
Likewise.
I'm going to talk a little bit today about looking out beyond CoSA at some other organizations and looking at both models that exist nationally, but also looking closer to home at your state and community level, keeping in mind a couple of things. One is that, no matter what your challenge is on the advocacy front, there's a good chance that somebody has had to tackle a similar problem in the past. And so we shouldn't ever feel like we're completely reinventing the wheel when it comes to trying to think about how we craft messages, how we think about who our audiences are, and how we reinforce those messages with the cooperation of stakeholders. Someone somewhere has had to deal with something similar to whatever it is that you're facing, even though everyone's circumstances are certainly a little bit unique. Another thing to keep in mind is that we are working in a national network of professional colleagues here, but most of us rely on state funding and have to interact with state stakeholders of some kind, whether those are executive branch, elected officials, or umbrella agencies under which we find ourselves placed, or working with legislators or the public, or a whole host of possible stakeholders who are out there. And it's true that every one of us works and lives in a state that, although there's lots of commonalities in state government across the United States, it's also true that every state is its own animal in one way or another. And I think it can be quite helpful to think about resources that exist outside the archival community, but within other types of public policy advocacy groups or organizations that are accustomed to working within the specific political ecosystem in which you happen to exist as a state archive. So I want to kind of skim through those various types of resources. And let's see. All right, first of all, I think there's probably not been any advocacy effort in state archives in recent decades that supersedes the effort in Georgia that took place a decade ago to save that institution. What was a storied institution, one that in the mid and late 20th centuries was considered among the strongest of the state archival programs in the country, trained a lot of people who went out to other states and contributed to state archival programs there. My predecessor in Alabama came out of the Georgia State Archives, and we owe the experience of professionalization and benchmarking to national standards that Ed Bridges brought here in the 1980s was a direct result of work that he had done in Georgia in the 1970s as a deputy director there. But over time, and in more recent decades, the state's support for the Georgia archives had waned. And about a decade ago, they found themselves in a terrible situation with a new Secretary of State, who's now the governor of Georgia, who decided in successive waves of budget cuts to place the entire weight of budget cuts in the Secretary of State's office solely on the state archives. And it created a situation where we all believe, based on what we were observing and hearing from Georgia, is that the Georgia State Archives could actually close its doors and just simply cease to function. And they were down to a minimal, not skeletal, doesn't even do justice to the staffing cuts that they experienced. But in response to that, there was an extraordinary statewide response to save the Georgia State Archives. And I'm not going to go into the details of this. Everything you want to know about the campaign to save the Georgia State Archives can be found in this issue from 2013 of Provenance, the Journal of the Society of Georgia Archivists. And it's freely available at this Digital Commons website at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. And I encourage you to look that up. What you're seeing here is not even half of the table of contents, but it really talks about how they built a network of collaboration, how they developed their message, how they took that message to the media and to elected officials in Atlanta, and ultimately wound up securing the placement of the Georgia State Archives in the University of Georgia system, where it still remains today, and is, I think our colleagues in Atlanta would say, is still recovering from this experience in many ways, but is in a much better place than it was a decade ago. And we're thankful to all of those who have been committed to rebuilding that program. But I point you to this as, I think, one of the best primers and guides to what can happen to a storied and accomplished program like the Georgia State Archives under poor state leadership among elected officials, and what it took to be able to make sure that that resource was not lost to the citizens of Georgia permanently. So take a look at that and check out that article in Provenance. You can also find similar messaging out among the professional, historical, and archival community at the same time that was responding to what was happening to Georgia. And I'm going to talk about the National Coalition for History a little bit more in just a second, but I was looking through their website and found this action alert from 2012 and thought that it was a very good model. And Jody talked about the importance of finding language that fits your particular circumstances. That's what's so useful about finding these caches of documents from other advocacy efforts, is that you can find paragraphs and language that helps you to think about what fits best for your particular situation. And you can see here in this message that was put out nationally, and CoSA was part of this effort as well, speaking to why all of us should care about what was happening to the Georgia State Archives and what the possible consequences would be of the lack of responsible action by state leadership to be sure that the Georgia State Archives did not close its doors permanently. There was a specific follow-up always. Once you get someone's attention, keep in mind, you always want to be able to point to specific things that you want them to do. It's not enough simply to say, we're in crisis, but what is it that the audience that you're speaking to can do to help you achieve what it is that you're wanting to do? And the more specific and concise that instruction can be, the better. And I think this is a good model of exactly what they were asking the public and supporters of history nationally to do back in 2012 in response to that particular crisis. So it's always to say what's needed, what are the steps that need to be followed, and then why does it matter and why do I care about it? It's always valuable to be able to include in your messaging a statement about why the person who's speaking to this public official, why they care about it, and why specifically this is an issue of personal importance to them. Another organization looking out among our other peer networks, the SAA's Committee on Public Policy maintains an advocacy guide that has been developed kind of within the professional community that includes CoSA. This is a great document that kind of is a good starting place for understanding how advocacy works at the state or local level, how to get connected with the people who understand what's happening on the ground and how things actually work in any given state government. You can find the URL there, and I'm sure we'll be able to send a follow-up message with these URLs if you can't find those or make note of that during the webinar. The latest issue of this advocacy guide, which is, I think, undergoing further revision right now, But even the version that you can find online has a section specifically devoted to working in state and local government. Our colleagues over at Nagara also have webinar series and other resources specifically pertinent to advocacy. Oh, excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold and my voice is not completely back yet. I've keyed in on a couple of items here on Nagara's website that I thought were especially meaningful that speak to the experiences of specific types of organizations. So whether you're, in this case, a rural county archives that is speaking to the challenges of that type of organization specifically, or in the second example here, talking about the roles that records professionals have in information systems development. So one of these is a message about what is it about us that's unique and therefore drives particular needs that our type of organization might have. And in the second example, something that I think is extremely important, and I find true all the time in state government, is having to make a case for why our state agency, why the archive should have a seat at the table whenever there are decisions being made about public policy, whether it's related to records retention or records access, or in this case, information systems development. Because don't we all wish that we could have a little bit of more influence in how state agencies make decisions about new records generating systems and the kinds of concerns related to retention and long-term viability for those systems that are of concern to us. So take a look at those and other resources available over at Nagara. These next couple of examples are all about learning through participation. Out in the larger cultural community, the American Alliance of Museums and also the National Humanities Alliance are two organizations that have very active advocacy programs and have annual Hill Visit Days in Washington, D.C., where members of those professional communities are invited to actually visit Washington, D.C. to go through some advocacy training and then to get out and meet with members of Congress, more commonly with their staffs, but occasionally you're able to meet face-to-face with a member of the House or a senator. But this is really invaluable experience in moving into what may be a rather intimidating and unfamiliar atmosphere the first time or two that you do it, but is a way to really build confidence and familiarity with how communicating to those with the purse strings and those with the authority to establish policy can be meaningful to you. So if you ever have an opportunity, for a couple of reasons, I encourage you to look at these opportunities through AAM or through the National Humanities Alliance. But for a couple of reasons. One, it can be good for you in developing your own skills, but two, we need more voices from the archival community to be part of those Hill visits, whether it's in museums, where frequently we talk about funding for IMLS, or through the NHA meetings where they're specifically focused on funding for the National Endowment for the Humanities. As you know, both of those federal granting agencies have competitive programs that are available to archival institutions. And so it's in our own interest to be part of those conversations and talking about how sound, robust federal funding can be of benefit to services that benefit the residents of the states where these members of Congress represent. The NHA also, and our own Barbara Teague, has been really instrumental in this, in helping to push more of a message related to archives and specifically of support for the National Archives and Records Administration as part of the National Humanities Alliance Hill Visits. And I know she would endorse, I have more experience with AAM and Museums Advocacy Day. Barbara is a regular attendee of the National Humanities Alliance visits. But I know that she would say that it's a valuable experience, and their website, even if you can't participate in the programs, their respective websites have lots of good information about advocacy. And as you can see, excuse me, on the NHA website, even an entire section devoted to top tips for nervous advocates. So if this is, excuse me, something outside your comfort zone, you can find some good resources there. Now, switching back to the NCH, the National Coalition for History, is an organization that represents a wide array of organizations working in the history field generally. So that includes the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, SAA, CoSA, the Preservation Community, AASLH, a whole host of groups are part of the coalition. It has a professional staff, a lobbyist in DC, who is there to speak on our behalf. And CoSA helps to direct the advocacy agenda for NCH. I will say, because they try to serve all aspects of the history field generally, you may find some things on the NCH website that you may not actually agree with related to archival administration, for example. And occasionally they've spoken on behalf of organizations of historians in ways that archivists may not actually cotton to. But it's still a valuable organization, and their website is especially rich in a deep archive of previous position statements over going back years. And so I encourage you to mine that resource. I found one that I thought was especially useful. As an example, it was a letter from NCH to Senator Susan Collins back in 2014, when there was a commission working on the new Smithsonian Museum for women's history. And again, I chose this example and highlighted some language because I think it's just a very effective model of an advocacy letter and good advocacy messaging and thinking about how to approach an audience. And so if you take a look at this letter, it starts out by talking about who am I, who are we? The folks who are writing to you. And so it explains who NCH is, what its membership consists of, and why they care about the new Smithsonian Museum for American women's history. And then the second paragraph goes on to say that the NCH supports that effort and what wants to see it succeed, but has some specific concerns about the way the legislation was shaped at the time. And then points out specifically what those concerns are, that there were not any, the bill did not stipulate that any professional historians be appointed to the commission charged with this feasibility study. And then the letter goes on to say, here are our 3 specific recommendations, that they wanted them to introduce language that required that professional historians be represented on the commission, that there be a fundraising role specified for this museum that would be removed from the legislation, and that it also have language requiring public input as part of its deliberations. So it offers those 3 suggestions and then says, please call on us to let us know what we can do, either to answer questions or to work with you to further advance the mission of this. So then I went and looked at the legislation that passed. And one of these 3 recommendations was incorporated into the final version of the law. 2 of them weren't. But that's an important point about advocacy, is that you're not going to get everything you want every time. Sometimes you can count as a victory the opportunity to influence just a little bit of change, to get part of your agenda incorporated into whatever the cause happens to be. And even if you don't get any of the points that you're trying to make adopted by your audience, you've developed relationship and you've introduced the organization, in this case, the NCH, as a voice that ought to be considered and respected in discussions and considerations of topics like the creation of a new Smithsonian Museum. Another resource that I want to be sure and point out to you that is really significant, and our colleagues over at the American Association for State and Local History undertook with, I believe it was IMLS funding, a project that's been a couple of years in development, working with an organization called the Frameworks Institute, which specializes in communications, to think about how, in this highly polarized environment that we find ourselves in, how can we better communicate what the purposes of history are, why it should be supported, what the work of a historian is. And the result of that is this document under the umbrella rubric of reframing history that you can find at the URL on the slide there. And it's a booklet that's been produced that has 4 key recommendations that are specifically about how we communicate as history professionals to non-historians or to non-archivists about the work that we do. And you can see what those are. I won't go all the way through those, but they're the kinds of things that is not sacred scripture. It's a roadmap. It's a guide that you can use and adapt and think about which one of these arguments or recommendations might work for me, and think about how you could use that in a specific context that you might be facing. Really recommend that you take a look at that and use it moving forward. ASLH is going to be promoting this broadly as one of a set of resources associated with the country's 250th anniversary coming up in 2026. And there is a podcast series that is just rolling out. I think the first episode might be out, talking about the reframing project and with people in the field that you may want to check out and learn a little bit more about how folks are anticipating using this. So then going from the national level down to the state level, like I said, we all live and work in states that have their own kind of ecosystems. Every state capital city has its own culture and vibes and ways of getting things done. So once you've taken those resources and ideas and points of communication that are available to you through the broader archival and public history community, don't forget to look at resources that are closer to home, either models or training that might be available from organizations that are available to you. I picked a couple of examples from my own state here that I'm familiar with. One is this organization called Alabama Arise. They're a public policy advocacy organization that works to alleviate poverty in our state. And they do that by trying to influence legislation on a whole host of issues related to healthcare and food security. In this case, this happens to be a fact sheet about underregulated auto title loans and why bad lending practices are bad for the working poor and people who live in poverty in our state. Well, that doesn't have a thing to do with archives or records management, but what it is a sample fact sheet created by an organization that is engaged full-time in advocacy and has had some successes in front of our legislature and in our state. And I can use that as a model to think about, how do I frame my argument? What is it that legislators are accustomed to seeing from organizations like Alabama Arise? And how could I adopt that very simple 2-page document to use a similar format to make whatever argument I need to before a stakeholder? Again, don't reinvent the wheel. Go find a wheel that works really well and adapt it to whatever your particular needs are. Another example are other nonprofit or nonpartisan organizations that might be in your state. Things like the League of Women Voters, which is of course a national organization, but has state level organizations in every state in the country. And especially if you're new to a state or if you're new to state government, I know many of us don't have the ability to go directly to legislators, but maybe your friend's organization does. If you're just trying to understand how things work, or even if you're just wanting to monitor, how the budget bills work through my state legislature, look to organizations like the League of Women Voters, who produce these kinds of resources for citizens to understand how state government works. And so I have used their resources before. Very often I can go to the Alabama legislature website and find something that purports to be something like this, but it's a little dense and sometimes vague and may not really tell me kind of the skinny on exactly how things happen. But if you go to a group like the League, they're a non-government organization interested in trying to shed light on the governing process and are inclined to offer good advice or information on how to understand what's happening in your state house. So I am going to transition there back to, I think, the next phase of our discussion, and I'll let Jody kind of handle this and give my voice a break, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Not a problem at all. Thank you very much. A lot of great information. We wanted to use this last section to kind of get an idea of what kinds of resources that you use. Were some of the ones that we provided surprises to? Are they things that you really used already? And maybe you'd like to share a story of how successful or not some of those resources were for you. Look at what CoSA can do to help you with your regional and local efforts that we're not already doing. What kinds of tools do you need? Do you have tools that you'd like to share? Because I think, and you folks have heard me say this before, but our biggest strength is each other. And you know, why reinvent the wheel if someone else already has an experience or has a tool that can help you model. We would love to see what you all have. And then specifically look at the importance of state archives document, because I think it does need to be updated. And if folks have some ideas on that, that would be great. Let's start with the first question here. What resources do you use most for advocacy? And just go ahead and put something in chat, or Becky, can we unmute someone if they ask to speak?
Yes, we should be able to.
Okay. Is there anyone who would like to speak up?
Hi, may I just add one thing?
Of course.
I put a link to the National Humanities Alliance advocacy materials in the chat. It's they just had Advocacy Day a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was last week. Anyway, it was sometime this month. And they update a policy priorities booklet every year with information about NEH, IMLS, the National Archives, and NHPRC, and then a couple of other agencies that, you know, we don't really advocate for, like title something with the Fulbright scholarships. And so I always sort of ignore that part, but they've got a lot of really good resources in that booklet. And then, like Steve pointed out, this link had links to, you know, tips for if you're nervous, tips for scheduling a visit, how to talk to your representative. So they have a lot of good basic materials that have been really useful to us, I think. And then, as Steve mentioned, the SAA, Committee on Public Policy, is going to revise the advocacy guide that we all worked on in 2018 for Archives on the Hill. And that's going to have some more information in it about contacting your district representative, and also on tips on virtual meetings, because most of the meetings that we've been having the past couple of years with any representative in Congress or their staff have all been virtual, usually Zoom, or like a couple of my representatives don't want to do Zoom. You just have to talk to them on the phone with like a myriad of people. So we're going to try to give you some tips on how to, how to navigate in the new world, because one of the tips used to be like, if you're in the congressperson's office or if you're in your legislator's office, look around, look at the pictures and look what the decor is and see what's important to them, which you can't really do when you're on a virtual meeting. So we're going to give some tips about how to do some more research on their interests before you end up going to meet with any of their staff. But I would recommend the NHA, the registration every year is only $100, and the program is always really good. They make your appointments for you with your representatives in Congress and your senators, and you just sort of show up, and you usually work with your state delegation to decide who says what, who's going to talk about the National Archives, who's going to talk about the Fulbright Scholarship. Anyway, it's just that I really would recommend that to everyone.
Great. Looks like we have a comment here by David. Advocacy is not impossible here, but we are part of a larger, highly hierarchical department, so we are expected to support the larger message, in which we sometimes get lost. Yeah, so the importance of having friends groups or allied professions really takes an important seat in advocacy in that kind of a situation. Thank you, David. That's a great comment. Anyone else want to comment about that, or give us an idea of your experiences with advocacy? I'm going to start calling on people if you don't. Dave Jones says, also don't forget advocacy would include advocating for yourself with that larger department. Absolutely, absolutely.
I'll second that comment by Dave, Jody, and say I think it's also important to think about, modes of advocacy that may not be directly about going to an elected official's office or to a legislative committee, but thinking about the kinds of advocacy that happen when you or your staff are giving behind the scenes tours. And we talk about that a lot here, and that every time an opportunity a collections manager has to talk about the work that we do and to talk about the value that work has for someone, when we've got VIP tours going on, for example, that's good sound advocacy, and and every bit of that works in a cumulative way to, I think, convey the message out to stakeholders about what it is that you're doing and why it matters.
Absolutely. Another thing that was really helpful for us in Montana, I think, was having connections with the folks who did reference requests and asking them to pass on to us any good pieces, stories that we could use as our hooks to use in advocacy. So, and if you look at the importance of state archives, that document, a lot of those are those kinds of reference related requests that, we were able to fulfill with our records. And that's a really great hook. Let's see. David, would you just like to talk? Can we unmute you and you can kind of tell us a little bit about your advocacy experience?
Can you hear me?
We certainly can.
Yeah, I think it's so important not to advocate just when you have an issue. If they don't know who you are, you're just another advocate, and they, and your cause may be just, but they don't know who you are. And you walk through the door, people walk through the door all the time. You build the connections, through time. And Steve had talked about, tours, doing tours for different people. That's a great way to go. We treat every patron the same. We treat them all well, but I'm not going to lie, when the legislature calls, a lot of times we'll hand deliver the documents that they want to get to know them, so they know our face and we know them. I think that's part of advocacy. And then the bigger issue, which somebody had said before, you're advocating within your department. We work for the Secretary of State's office. There's 23 departments here. All of them asking for money, all of them asking for resources. It helps if they know, the people at the archives and what we do. We just got a grant from NHPRC, just a couple of years ago, to digitize photos from the state photographer from the 1940s to 1992. So as we were getting close to the end of the grant, I called over to the front office and said to communications and again, the front office, Black History is coming up. We have all these great photos from events for 40 years that, relate to Black history. We have a Facebook page, we being the Secretary of State's office. Wouldn't that be something if we started to post this on our Facebook? And they were thrilled. And we're doing that now for women's history. It's part of being a team player, of course, But you know, there's a hidden motive there. It's part of advocating. They know who we are. They know a little bit more about what we do. It's not just advocating, hey, I need more money for this or this or this. It's like, wow, these guys, you know, again, you're advocating and you're known, and that's such an important part of advocacy.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm kind of curious about this, if there are tools that you have created, or if folks are being, like you said, Dave, more proactive. Do you have statements that you've put together that you can tweak in an instant or quickly that you would be willing to share, or that you found that kind of resource someplace else?
You're talking about statements like what?
Yeah, the importance of state archives, the importance of access to government records, the importance of diversity, you know, just things that you can add information to if a particular issue comes up.
I don't know. What I was kind of more talking about was, again, the personal contact, the face-to-face, not handing them a sheet of paper.
Sure.
Now we just turned 100 last year. We had our centennial. So visitors who come here, we put together a really nice booklet on the history of the state archives in all our different departments. And so that's a nice handout to give to people. But generally, again, I'm just talking, you know, the face-to-face, the phone calls. There used to be a TV commercial that said we're losing touch because all we do is fax. That's how old the commercial is and how old I am. But all we do is fax and email. We don't have the, you know, the phone call or the personal contact. Again, that's within your bureaucracy and within your state, especially. That's so important.
Sorry, that question was more for everybody. If there's anyone out there who has statements that they have kind of set up so that they can plunk in information as they need to, or if you use the importance of state archives as that kind of a document. I was just kind of curious to know if anybody's doing that. Okay, well, maybe that's something we can work on for the advocacy committee, is creating some of those documents. Let's look at the importance of the state archives document. Just a show of hands, how many folks have used that as the base of advocacy statements or that sort of thing? Looks like we have a few. Okay, what would make that document a little more user-friendly if you're not currently using it? Again, you can put this in chat or just ask, raise your hand, and we can unmute you. I think for me, just looking at the document, I think one of the big things is just maybe updating some of the topics and some of the statistics and stuff, but yeah, that's part of the reason I was asking about that, Barbara, was that I just wanted to see what people thought about how we could potentially update that. Okay, well,
Jody,
it looks like
I'll add that, you know, I think to build on that question, one of the key things that we'll need in doing the document update is some fresh examples of success stories and relevance of state archives programs and providing services to the public. So that's a specific request we make that we will repeat in email out to the full membership. But as you can think about this and, you know, and talk to your reference staff who may have specific examples that you may not even recall or know of about how they have been able to serve constituents in a especially meaningful way. Those can be really powerful parts of this story, and we know that we want to make some updates to what we have there.
absolutely. Okay, well, it looks like our hour is up. If there are no more questions or statements that folks would like to share? I guess we can move on to the sort of the wrap up here. Lisa, would you like to take over?
Thank you, Jody. And let's see, we can hopefully, there we go. So we've done questions, and just a reminder to everyone, of course, we hope you've enjoyed today's webinar, but we're going to continue with next month. And one of the things the Education Department committee has been doing is actually been trying to be very aware of needs as they arise. And because of a thread in the community, we're putting together next month's webinar on restarting or revitalizing your SHRAB. So don't think that, that's another good way is that, enough people started saying, hey, I want more information. And we said, you know what, maybe we should bring people together and talk about it. So anyway, join us next month for that. So we hope we'll see you there. Don't forget, Sari also has more webinars, and log on so that you can take care of that and attend those as well. As always, there's lots of ways to communicate with us at CoSA, and we hope you reach out and do that. And naturally, none of this is possible without the funding from our sponsors and funders. So if you are familiar with any of them, thank them. But this is who helps make us as good as we are and take events. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. We will have some feedback. We have a brand new evaluation form. It's just been updated by the Education Committee. So I do hope you'll take time and answer it. First of all, we want to make sure the process works. And second of all, we really are interested in your feedback about these evaluations. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'd like to thank Steve and Jody as our presenters for some wonderful ideas on what's out there that you can use for advocacy. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And we hope we'll see you again tomorrow at the next CoSA webinar. So thank you very much. Have a great day.